counting data within groups with group by. So far, we've learned how to use the count function to count data in a table with a where clause, not null, and distinct values. This will all give us a single number, but what if we want to find the number of times a value appears in a table, or another way, the occurrences of a value? Earlier in this course, when learning how to use distinct, we looked at how to find duplicate values. Being able to use the count function to count how many of a certain value exists is a great way of finding this number. Instead of showing a single overall count, we can find the count per value. For example, we can have a count per last name to see the most common last name. We could have a count per first name to see the most common first name. We could have a count per salary to see how often each salary value occurs. We can also count per hire date to see the most common hire date. So how do we do this? We use a concept called grouping. This allows us to group values when using certain functions. The count function is what's called an aggregate function. It takes several values and aggregates or combines them into a single value. In our earlier examples, we took 200 records in the employee table and displayed a single record with a single value. Grouping is a way that we can use aggregate functions differently. It allows us to say, instead of showing the count for everything, show me these values and the count of each of these values. It means we can see all of the last names and the count of each last name in the same query. To do grouping, we have the group by clause. It comes after the where clause, but before order by. So just to recap, we have select, then from, then where, then group by, and then order by. The group by specifies what columns are grouped. Now let's see an example. Let's find a list of all the last name values and the count of each of those values. We start with select, and then last name. Then we have a comma, and then we put in our count function. And we're going to count star this time. Then we have from employee. Now what happens if we run this? We think we're looking for the last name and the count of those last names. We get an error that says not a single group function. What does this mean? It's a very common error when working with aggregate functions. It just means that we need a group by clause to include the column we're using. This is because we're using a column here and an aggregate function in the same query. We'll add the group by clause now. Put group by on a new line, and then put in the column name, which is last_name. So this query says, show me the last names and the count for each last name in the employee table. Let's run this query. You can see the results are shown here. It will show all of the last name values and then a count for each last name. It will say, it's shown us that Turner has only one occurrence of that name, but Lewis, there are 2 people with Lewis as a surname. Let's have a look at another example. Let's select all the data from the product table. This will show us all the products that we have. How do we find the number of products per department ID? We can write a similar query. We start with select, and then write department ID, because that's what we want to see. And then comma, and then count star. Then we put in the from clause, and we're using the from product table this time. Then we have group by, and then department ID. This is because we want to see the department ID and the count records within each group of the department ID values. So if we run this query, we'll see this output. We can see department ID 4 has a count of 3 and department ID 5 has a count of 5 products. With the group by, just remember that any columns in the select clause that aren't aggregate functions need to go in the group by, So earlier that was the last name column, and now it's the department ID column. So that's how you use the group by to group data when using count and other functions. You can use the same syntax and the same group by when using other aggregate functions. We'll cover other aggregate functions later in this section. But next, we'll look at grouping data when using a where clause and ordering our results after grouping.